Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. Today we're talking about Minardi and their top 10 drives. Minardi competed in Formula 1 from 1985 to 2005 before morphing into Toro Rosso and then AlphaTauri as we now know them today. Back throughout their time, they were often towards the back of the field and struggled to score points, but despite this, they developed into a fan favorite as well as my personal favorite team. To see how much they struggle to get results though, you only have to look at some stats. In their 340 starts, they only finished in the points on 21 occasions and hold the record for the team with the most starts without a podium and also the most without a win if you count Arrows and Footwork as separate teams. They have the best result of 4th, which they achieved 3 times, but despite this lack of success, it doesn't mean they didn't have good drivers driving for them. They gave 2-time world champion Fernando Alonso the start of his career, as well as the start of careers to other promising young drivers including Alessandro Nannini, Giancarlo Fisichella, Jarno Trulli, and Mark Webber. Because of this, there are still many strong drives if you look deeper into what appears to be just mediocre results. Today we're looking at what I consider to be the top 10 drives in Minardi history. Before continuing though, if you enjoyed the video, then please give it a like and share the video, and if you want to see more similar content, then you can subscribe to the channel. Now on to the top 10. To start off our list, we begin with one I debated about for a while whether I should put it in as it ended in an accident, but ultimately I decided to include it at number 10. The driver we're looking at here is Pierluigi Martini at the 1993 Hungarian Grand Prix. Given how synonymous Martini is at Minardi, it should be no surprise to see him a few times on this list, and this is his first of a few entries. Martini had stayed out the first half of 1993, but rejoined Minardi at Silverstone, making Hungary his 3rd race of the year. Martini started off the weekend qualifying 7th, which was by far Minardi's best qualifying of the year, beating the 13th Christian Fittipaldi set at the season opener in South Africa. He dropped to 9th at the start, and that's where he ran for much of the race's early stages, but he found himself on the gearbox of the footwork of Derek Warwick on the track that is notoriously difficult to overtake on. There were a few retirements early on, and between that and the first pit stop sequence, Martini briefly ran as high as 4th before making a pit stop. He rejoined in 6th though, but this time he was not only right behind Warwick, but also the Ligier of Martin Brundle. He would remain under 2 seconds from the two drivers for basically the whole stint until he pitted again for tires on lap 56. Shortly after was when disaster would strike and Martini crashed, ending his day. His first lap after pitting, he was 3 seconds quicker than Brundle, who pitted almost immediately after, so it's likely he would have jumped him. Warwick, on the other hand, didn't make a second stop, but Brundle only took about 10 laps to gain back the time at Warwick he lost in the pits before backing off with gear selection problems, so maybe Martini could have passed Warwick without the error and finished in 4th, ahead of numerous cars that were quicker than Minardi throughout 1993. This was impressive in itself, but even more impressive when you consider Martini did this with a broken rib, enough to look at it as a what could have been. Michele Alboreto had a long career in Formula 1 through the 80s and 90s, but spent 1994 in what I think was kind of a forgotten year with Minardi for his last year in the sport. He did, however, have a bright spot in Monaco, which slots in at number 9. Alboreto qualified a season best 12th, but moved up to 8 at the start and settled in there for the early stages. Much of the first half of the race was pretty lonely for Alboreto with no battles until the Jordan of Andrea de Cesaris closed in near half distance. De Cesaris would jump him under the pit stop sequence and quickly pulled away, leaving Alboreto once again near no competitors on the track. Retirements of Mark Blundell and Christian Fittipaldi followed, which promoted Alboreto up to 6th, and that was where he would remain for the rest of the race to score his final career point. It was a pretty lonely race overall for Alboreto, but he did finish 24 seconds clear of the Benetton of J.J. Leto, as well as some other cars Minardi was competing with throughout 1994, and was only 17 seconds behind the Ferrari of Jean Alesi, although Alesi did have to make an extra stop for a wing change. Nonetheless, it was still a very solid finish, especially given Minardi's competitiveness at the time. Fernando Alonso did an incredible job with Minardi in his rookie year in 2001, so it should be no surprise to see him on this list multiple times, and for his first entry at number 8, we have his home race in Spain. Alonso qualified 18th ahead of both Benettons for the second straight race, but ran in 16th for much of the early stages and pressuring Giancarlo Fisichella for 15th. He was one of the first drivers to make his first stop on lap 15, but when Fisichella pitted nearly 10 laps later, Alonso had done enough to clear the Benetton by almost 4 seconds. He was about 30 seconds behind the next car, Luciano Berti, at this point, but he started to very slowly close in the Prost, as well as the Arrows of Jos Verstappen, who was ahead of Berti. Both Alonso and Verstappen would pit in lap 39, and from that point on, Verstappen would become Alonso's race as Berti would pull away. After their stops, Alonso had the gap down to 21 seconds behind Verstappen, but Alonso started gaining quickly and for many laps was between 1 and 2 seconds quicker. After 59 laps, Alonso had gotten the gap down to less than a second and hoped to make one final gain in position, but it was not meant to be, and he finished in 13th, just 4/10 behind Verstappen, but he did clear the Benetton of Fisichella by over a minute and was an additional 40 seconds clear of the second Benetton of Jenson Button. It was drives like this that the paddock took note of that propelled Alonso to seats higher up the grid. Christian Fittipaldi drove with Minardi in 1892 and 1893 and put in some good drives over the 2 years, but the only one that made the cut for me was the 1992 Japanese Grand Prix at number 7. He qualified 12th, which matched Minardi's best result of the season, and just a few laps into the race he made it up to 10th while pulling away slightly from the Ferrari of Jean and Alesi behind him. He made it up to 7th briefly before making a pit stop on lap 20, and after the pit stop sequence he settled into 9th behind Alesi, who had jumped him during the stops. He seemed to be quicker than the Ferrari, though, sitting about a second behind each lap, but while looking for a way by, he also had to deal with the pressure of the Jordan of Stefano Modena behind him. As the laps went by, neither of the drivers could make a move staying in their positions, but a few retirements ahead promoted the drivers up a few spots. On lap 45, Fittipaldi moved up into 6th, still looking for a way by Alesi, and as the closing laps approached, Modena backed off behind as he had to save a bit of fuel. This allowed Fittipaldi to fully focus on the car ahead of him, and as he came around to start the last lap, he was in 3/10 of Alesi. However, it was not enough. Despite this, Fittipaldi finished in 6th for what was his first career point, and the only point Minardi scored in 1992, so it was still a quite deserved result for Fittipaldi. Mark Webber's most famous moment with Minardi was a 5th-place finish in his home race in Australia on debut, and while that drive did come close to making my list, it was a drive he put in at France that I put in at number 6 instead. He qualified 18th but moved up to 14th at the start, and held his position there for the initial stages of the race. He held the position despite being pressured by the Jaguar of Pedro de la Rosa and the Jordan of Takuma Sato behind him, while he kept pace with the BAR of Jacques Villeneuve and Toyota of Alan McNish ahead. During the first pit stop sequence, he jumped McNish, who had a bit of a slow stop, and managed to keep him a few seconds back, while he also managed to keep pace with the second Toyota of Mika Salo ahead. He jumped Salo during the second pit stop sequence, although Salo would retire shortly after, and by lap 52 of the 72-lap race, he had moved up into 8th place and had charging McNish gaining on him. After 65 laps, McNish had gotten within 3.5 seconds of Webber before retiring with an engine failure, and from that point on he was able to finish 8th comfortably ahead of De La Rosa, and very well could have beaten both Toyotas, while he finished just 22 seconds behind the Sauber of Nick Heidfeld. While the 5th-place finish in Australia was a better result, which came in a race of very high attrition, it feels like Webber got more out of his car on this day and now preferred more cars than he probably shouldn't have than Australia. Minardi's most famous moment from 2000 was when Gaston Mazzacani briefly ran 3rd at the US Grand Prix and even passed Mika Hakkinen on track, but he also found a very good drive from his teammate Marc Genet in Austria that year, which comes in at number 5. Genet only qualified 20th, but after a brilliant start as well as an opening lap crash that caused 3 drivers to retire, Genet was up to 10th. He moved up to 8th after an early safety car period, and surprisingly stayed there for most of the first half of the race, holding off cars behind him including Jean Alesi, Alex Wirtz, and Jacques Villeneuve, and was keeping pace with Jenson Button and Johnny Herbert directly in front of him from the final points-paying position. He then ran as high as 7th before making his only pit stop on lap 43, and after the pit stop sequence he settled back into 8th. He was clear of the Benetton of Alex Wirtz and the Sauber of Pedro Diniz, who were slowly closing in on him, but in the latter stages of the race he was able to defend his position in 8th, which matched Minardi's best result of the season. Perhaps even more impressive, though, was the fact that he was only about 8 seconds off of Mika Salo for the final point, and only about 17 seconds off of the BAR Villeneuve for 4th, which for Minardi at the time was incredible. Pierluigi Martini famously led Minardi's only lap at the 1989 Portuguese Grand Prix, and while that race was under consideration for this list, it was a drive that he put in at Portugal 2 years later that I decided to include at number 4. He qualified 8th and then jumped up to 7th at the start, and that was where he remained for much of the first half of the race. However, he was able to pull away from most of the cars behind him and stayed within 10 seconds of Alain Prost in the Ferrari ahead. Most drivers pitted around lap 30, and Martini jumped up to 6th in the sequence after race leader Nigel Mansell had a poor pit stop in which the right rear tire wasn't fully attached. By lap 40, he had moved up to 4th following the retirement of Prost and the McLaren of Gerhard Berger, but was closing in on the 3rd place Ferrari of Jean Alesi. On lap 43, he pulled within half a second of Alesi and remained within a second for the next 6 laps before he slowly started to tail off. He remained in 4th, matching Minardi's best finish, and while he wasn't able to beat Alesi with a factory Ferrari engine compared to a customer one in Martini's Minardi, he still finished only 10 seconds behind and did still beat both Benetton drivers Nelson Piquet and Michael Schumacher. Next at number 3, we have Martini again, and this time at the 1989 British Grand Prix. I already made a video about Minardi's best team result in this race, which I'll leave a link to in the description, and it included a 5th from Martini, and I consider his drive to be impressive enough to include here. Martini had a solid qualifying of 11th, and then jumped to 8th at the start, but just 5 laps in, it looked like things may end early when Martini came into the pits with an overheating issue. However, he was able to get going again quickly, but down in 23rd, and started to quickly make up his lost ground. On lap 20, he had already made it back up to 14th, and by the halfway point in lap 32, he was back up to 9th and chasing down his teammate Luis Perez Sala for 8th. On lap 38, he not only passed Perez Sala, but also the Lotus of Satoru Nakajima, and a lap later, Felipe Alio retired from 6th, which promoted Martini to that position. On lap 55, Mauricio Gugelmin retired, which brought Martini up to 5th, which is where he would stay at the end to give Minardi their best ever result to date and just their 2nd ever points finish. Any 5th place finish in a Minardi is at least worthy of consideration for a list like this, but one that came with a recovery drive like Martini had that day certainly had to be on here. The 2nd and final entry of Fernando Alonso on this list comes in at number 2, and it is the 2001 season finale in Japan, which was probably Alonso's most famous drive from his rookie year. He started off by qualifying 18th, which was pretty normal by the time the season reached a close. He remained there at the start after a brief battle with a BAR of Olivier Panis, which Panis won at the time, but Alonso stayed right in his gearbox for the race's opening stint, while also holding off the Prost of Thomas Enge, who was right behind him. Panis pitted first, but after a slow pit stop, Alonso was able to jump him, and along with a few retirements, he was up to 13th place on lap 25. He'd remained there for a while, and much of his second stint was quite lonely, and after making his final stop, he was still in 13th with a Prost of Heinz-Harald Frentzen about 16 seconds behind him. Over the final part of the race, Frentzen was able to close the gap down, and for the final few laps was looking for a way past the Minardi. Alonso held off Frentzen's Prost as he did with Enge at the start of the race and brought the car home to an 11th place finish ahead of Frentzen, both Arrows cars, and Panis, who was nearly 50 seconds clear of. The result was an incredible result for Minardi, and what Paul Stoddart famously stated was effectively 53 qualifying laps. For number 1, we go to what may be the most famous drive in Minardi history. That drive will be Luca Badoer at the 1999 European Grand Prix. While famous in its own right, when you look deeper into it, it looks even more impressive. Badoer qualified 19th and remained near the back for the first third of the race, but then rain played havoc. A brief shower brought some drivers into the pits for wet tires, but it ended quickly, leaving those drivers to have to pit again for dries. Badoer was not among those drivers, which promoted him up to 10th. Rain would come again, though, causing another pit stop sequence, and after most of the drivers pitted, Badoer found himself to be in 7th. A few of the front runners started to run into trouble over the next few laps, and on lap 51, Badoer moved up to 4th position, but just a few laps later his gearbox failed, leaving the famous scene of Badoer crying over his car, knowing he lost the chance of his first career points in an unbelievable result for Minardi. Obviously, a 4th would have been an extraordinary result at the time, but could the result have been even better? Well, if you look further into it, it possibly could have. On lap 35, Badoer pitted for what should have been his only stop of the race, and he was about 3.5 seconds behind eventual second-place finisher Jarno Trulli. However, Badoer had an incredibly slow stop, spending 57 seconds on pit lane, compared to the others who were spending on average 25 to 30 seconds. Badoer even lost an additional 10 seconds in the pits than Eddie Irvine did earlier in the race in his famously slow stop when Ferrari did not have a tire to put on his right rear. Despite losing the additional 30 seconds, this is when Badoer did his best work. For much of this period of the race until he retired, he is one of the fastest cars on track, and from laps 45 to 49, he set the fastest lap in the whole field, including lap 47, in which he was about 2 seconds quicker than any other car on the lead lap. Both a McLaren and a Ferrari were still in the race at the time, so it wasn't even just other back markers he was quicker than. At the time he retired, he was 17 seconds behind third place Rubens Barrichello and 24 seconds behind Trulli, so had he not lost 30 seconds in the pits, he could have potentially retired from second place. Maybe even at one point there could have been a thought about Badoer chasing down eventual winner Johnny Herbert for the win. Now, after Badoer's retirement, the track did dry out, which probably would have made it harder for him to keep pace with the other drivers around him, but it doesn't change what a spectacular job Badoer did that day, and that the fourth place he lost had true potential of being a podium. Unfortunately for Badoer, that elusive first point never came, but on the bright side for Minardi, Marc Gené finished sixth, giving the team their first point in nearly 4 years. So there you have it. That would be my top 10 best drives in Minardi's 21-year history, and while there are plenty others that I did have close to making the list, these are ultimately the 10 I decided to go with. While never winning or even finishing on the podium, the team played an important role in F1 history, and as you can see, had quite a few familiar names driving for them. Let me know what you think, though. What do you consider to be the best drive in Minardi history, and were there any that you think should have made the cut into the top 10? Thanks for watching.